Have you ever wondered how a single moment of courage can shatter the chains of destiny? Today, I'll tell you the extraordinary true story of Silas, an enslaved boy whose simple question to a governor's daughter would ignite a revolution that neither of them could have imagined. Subscribe to our channel now. You won't want to miss how this incredible journey unfolds. The year was 1847, and the Grand Whitmore estate stood like a monument to Southern aristocracy in the heart of Charleston, South Carolina. Its towering white columns and sprawling verandas spoke of wealth built upon the backs of those who would never taste its luxury. Inside these walls lived Governor Edmund Whitmore, a man whose political ambitions were matched only by his rigid adherence to the social order that had made him powerful. The morning sun filtered through the estate's ornate windows, casting golden patterns across Persian rugs that cost more than most families would see in a lifetime. In the servants' quarters, a different world existed, one of hushed voices, calloused hands, and dreams deferred. Silas Washington was 12 years old, though the weight of his circumstances made him seem older. His dark eyes held a spark of intelligence that no amount of oppression could extinguish, and his quick mind had already learned to navigate the treacherous waters of plantation life. Born into bondage, he had never known freedom, yet something deep within him refused to accept that this was all life had to offer. "Silas," the sharp voice of Mrs. Hartwell, the head housekeeper, cut through the morning air. "Master Whitmore wants the parlor dusted before Miss Eleanor's tutoring session, and mind you don't touch anything you shouldn't." The boy nodded silently, gathering his cleaning supplies with practiced efficiency. Mrs. Hartwell was a stern woman, but not unkind. She had learned long ago that survival meant following rules without question. As Silas made his way through the servant corridors toward the main house, his bare feet made no sound on the polished wooden floors. The transition from the servants' quarters to the main house was like stepping into another world. Here, everything gleamed with wealth and refinement. Crystal chandeliers caught the morning light, sending rainbows dancing across silk wallpaper. Oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors gazed down from gilded frames, their eyes seeming to follow any who dared walk these hallowed halls. Silas paused at the threshold of the grand parlor, his heart racing. This room was the crown jewel of the Whitmore mansion, a space reserved for the most important guests and family gatherings. Rarely was he allowed inside, and never alone. The responsibility felt enormous, but so did the opportunity. As he stepped inside, the boy's breath caught in his throat. The parlor was even more magnificent than he had imagined. Sunlight streamed through tall windows draped in emerald velvet, illuminating furniture that seemed to glow with its own inner light. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, its marble mantelpiece adorned with delicate porcelain figurines. Books lined built-in shelves, their leather spines creating a rainbow of knowledge that seemed to call to him. But it was the figure by the window that truly captured his attention. Miss Eleanor Whitmore sat in a high-backed chair, completely absorbed in a leather-bound volume. At 16, she possessed the ethereal beauty that Southern society prized, pale skin that had never known the harsh touch of manual labor, golden hair arranged in perfect ringlets, and a dress of powder blue silk that probably cost more than Silas's family would earn in several years. She was everything he was not: free, educated, privileged. Yet as he watched her read, something in her expression struck him as familiar. There was a hunger in her eyes, a searching quality that he recognized in his own reflection when he caught glimpses of himself in the estate's mirrors. Silas began his work quietly, moving with the practiced stealth that all house servants learned. He dusted the ornate side tables, careful not to disturb the crystal figurines and silver candlesticks that adorned them. Each piece represented wealth beyond his comprehension, yet he handled them with the reverence of someone who understood their value, if not their purpose. As he worked, he found himself stealing glances at Miss Eleanor. She seemed completely unaware of his presence, lost in whatever world her book had opened for her. Her lips moved slightly as she read, and occasionally she would pause to gaze out the window with a wistful expression that puzzled him. What could someone who had everything possibly long for? The question nagged at him as he continued his duties. Here was a girl who lived in luxury, who had access to education, who would never know hunger or fear the lash. Yet something in her demeanor suggested a kind of imprisonment that he couldn't quite understand. Silas was polishing a silver tea service when disaster struck. His cloth caught on the handle of a delicate cup, sending it tumbling toward the marble floor. Time seemed to slow as he watched the precious porcelain fall, knowing that its destruction would mean severe punishment, perhaps even a beating. But the cup never hit the ground. Miss Eleanor had moved with surprising speed, catching the falling china in her hands. For a moment they both froze, the enslaved boy and the governor's daughter, connected by this shared moment of crisis averted. "Thank you, miss," Silas whispered, his voice barely audible. He had been taught never to speak unless spoken to, especially not to members of the family. Eleanor looked at him with curious blue eyes, as if truly seeing him for the first time. "You're welcome," she said softly, then added, "What's your name?" The question caught him off guard. In all his years at the estate, no member of the Whitmore family had ever asked his name. He was simply boy or you there when they needed to address him at all. "Silas, miss. Silas Washington." "Washington," she repeated thoughtfully. "That's a noble name." He didn't know how to respond to that. The name had been given to his grandfather by a previous owner, a common practice that stripped enslaved people of their African heritage, while ironically bestowing upon them the surnames of the very men who had founded a nation on the principle that all men were created equal. Eleanor carefully placed the rescued cup back on its saucer, then returned to her chair. But instead of resuming her reading, she continued to watch him work. The attention made Silas nervous. He was accustomed to being invisible, a shadow that moved through the house completing tasks without acknowledgement. "You're very careful with things," she observed. "More careful than some of our guests, I'd say." Again, Silas didn't know how to respond. Was she testing him, looking for a reason to report some transgression to her father? He had heard stories of enslaved people being punished for the smallest perceived slights, and he couldn't afford to make any mistakes. "I try to be respectful of your family's belongings, miss," he said carefully. Eleanor tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Can you read, Silas?" The question hit him like a physical blow. Reading was forbidden for enslaved people in South Carolina. It was considered dangerous, a tool that might give them ideas above their station. The penalty for teaching an enslaved person to read could be severe, both for the teacher and the student. "No, miss," he lied, though the words tasted bitter in his mouth. But Eleanor seemed to see through his deception. Her eyes flicked to the bookshelf, then back to his face. "That's a shame," she said quietly. "There are so many wonderful worlds in these books, so many ideas and adventures." She held up the volume she had been reading, a collection of poetry by Lord Byron. "This one is about a man who refuses to accept the limitations that society places on him. He fights against injustice, even when it seems hopeless." Silas felt his heart racing. Was she speaking in code? Was this some kind of test, or was Miss Eleanor Whitmore actually expressing sympathy for his condition? "It must be nice," he said carefully, "to be able to escape into other worlds." "Yes," she agreed, but there was sadness in her voice. "Though sometimes I wonder if reading about freedom is just another kind of prison." The comment puzzled him. How could someone who had everything feel imprisoned? But before he could ponder it further, the sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway announced the approach of someone important. "That will be my tutor," Eleanor said quickly. "You should finish your work." Silas nodded and returned to his dusting with renewed urgency. Within moments, a stern-faced man in a black suit entered the parlor. Professor Aldrich was a thin, severe-looking gentleman who had been hired to provide Eleanor with the education befitting a young lady of her station, which meant literature, music, a bit of French, and the social graces necessary to make an advantageous marriage. "Good morning, Miss Whitmore," Professor Aldrich said with a formal bow. "I trust you've completed your reading assignment." "Yes, Professor," Eleanor replied, though Silas noticed she didn't mention which book she had been reading. As the tutor began setting up his materials, Silas finished his work and prepared to leave. But as he reached the doorway, Eleanor's voice stopped him. "Silas," he turned, surprised to be addressed again. Thank you for being so careful with our things. It's appreciated." The words were simple, but the kindness in her voice was something he had rarely experienced from the White family. As he left the parlor, Silas felt something stirring within him, a dangerous emotion that he had been taught to suppress: hope. 3 days passed before Silas was assigned to clean the parlor again. During those 3 days, he found himself thinking constantly about his brief interaction with Miss Eleanor. Her kindness had been unexpected, but more than that, her words about books and other worlds had awakened something in him that he had tried to keep buried. The truth was, Silas could read. His ability was a closely guarded secret, one that could cost him dearly if discovered. He had learned in the most unlikely of places, the estate's chapel, where an elderly enslaved woman named Mama Ruth had secretly taught a small group of children using a worn Bible that she had somehow acquired. Mama Ruth had been sold away 2 years ago, but not before she had given Silas the most dangerous gift imaginable: literacy. "Knowledge is power," she had whispered to him during their last lesson. "And power is what they fear most. Use it wisely, child. Use it to set yourself free." Now, as Silas made his way back to the parlor, those words echoed in his mind. He had been careful to hide his ability, knowing that discovery would mean severe punishment, but Miss Eleanor's comments about books and other worlds had stirred something within him, a hunger for knowledge that was becoming impossible to ignore. The parlor was empty when he arrived, bathed in the soft light of late afternoon. Silas began his work methodically, but his eyes kept drifting to the bookshelf that lined one wall. Hundreds of volumes stood there, representing more knowledge than he could absorb in a lifetime. Poetry, philosophy, history, science, all forbidden to him by the accident of his birth and the color of his skin. He was dusting a table near the bookshelf when temptation overcame caution. Glancing around to ensure he was alone, Silas reached for a slim volume of poetry. His hands trembled as he opened it, drinking in the words that danced across the page like music made visible. "She walks in beauty, like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes." The words of Lord Byron filled his mind with images of beauty and freedom that seemed to exist in a world far removed from his own reality. For a few precious moments, he was transported beyond the walls of the Whitmore estate, beyond the constraints of his bondage, into a realm where beauty and truth mattered more than the color of one's skin. "That's one of my favorites." Silas spun around, his heart hammering with terror. Miss Eleanor stood in the doorway, but instead of the anger he expected, her face showed only curiosity and something that might have been approval. "Miss, I was just—" He fumbled for an explanation, knowing that none would suffice. He had been caught red-handed, violating one of the most fundamental rules of his existence. "You were reading," Eleanor said simply, stepping into the room and closing the door behind her, "and reading quite well from what I could observe." Silas felt the world tilting beneath his feet. Discovery meant punishment, possibly even death. Yet Miss Eleanor's tone held no threat, only a kind of wonder that confused him. "Please don't tell your father," he whispered, his voice breaking with fear. "I know I shouldn't have. I know it's forbidden." Eleanor moved closer, her silk dress rustling softly. "Who taught you?" The question was asked gently, but Silas knew that answering could endanger others. Even though Mama Ruth was long gone, there might be others who could be implicated. I taught myself, miss. Bits and pieces, here and there." It was partially true. Much of his learning had come from stolen moments with discarded newspapers and overheard conversations, but Eleanor's knowing look suggested she didn't entirely believe him. "That's remarkable," she said, and there was genuine admiration in her voice. "Do you know how rare that is, how extraordinary?" Silas didn't know how to respond. In his world, his literacy was a source of constant fear, not pride. The idea that someone might find it admirable was foreign to him. Eleanor moved to the bookshelf and selected another volume, a collection of essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson. "Have you read any of his work?" Silas shook his head, still too frightened to speak freely. "He writes about self-reliance, about the importance of thinking for oneself, rather than simply accepting what society tells us is true. She opened the book and read aloud, "Nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind." The words hit Silas like a physical force. Here was a white man, writing in a book that sat openly on a southern plantation owner's shelf, advocating for the very kind of independent thinking that enslaved people were forbidden to possess. "Why are you showing me this?" Silas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the sprawling grounds of the estate. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that seemed too heavy for her 16 years. "Because I think you understand something that most people don't," she said. "I think you understand what it means to feel trapped." The comment startled him. "But miss, you have everything. You're free to—" "Am I?" Eleanor interrupted, turning to face him with eyes that blazed with unexpected intensity. "Am I free, Silas? I cannot choose my own husband. That will be arranged for me based on political and financial considerations. I cannot pursue my own interests. My education is limited to what society deems appropriate for a lady. I cannot even express my own opinions. I must smile and nod and agree with whatever the men in my life decide is best." She gestured around the opulent room. "This beautiful cage is still a cage, even if the bars are made of gold." Silas stared at her, struggling to process what he was hearing. The idea that someone with Miss Eleanor's privileges could feel imprisoned seemed almost blasphemous. Yet the pain in her voice was real, and for the first time he began to understand that there might be different kinds of bondage. "At least," he said carefully, "you won't be sold away from your family. You won't be whipped for learning to read. You won't watch your children taken from you and sold to strangers." Eleanor's face crumpled with shame and recognition. "You're right," she whispered. "I'm sorry, I have no right to complain when your suffering is so much greater than mine." "I didn't mean to diminish your feelings, miss," Silas said quickly, surprised by his own boldness in continuing the conversation. I've never heard someone in your position speak of feeling trapped." "Perhaps that's because we're not supposed to," Eleanor replied. "Perhaps that's part of the trap, pretending that we're content with the roles society has assigned us." She moved to the window, gazing out at the gardens where other enslaved people worked under the watchful eyes of overseers. "Do you ever wonder what lies beyond these grounds, Silas? What the world is like outside of Charleston, outside of South Carolina?" The question stirred something deep within him, a longing he had tried to suppress for years. "Every day," he admitted. "I dream of traveling," Eleanor continued, her voice taking on a wistful quality, "of seeing the great cities of Europe, of visiting the places I read about in books. I dream of attending university, of engaging in debates about philosophy and literature with brilliant minds. I dream of making my own choices about my life." She turned back to him, and Silas was shocked to see tears in her eyes. "But those are just dreams. My future has already been decided. Father is negotiating a marriage contract with Senator Morrison's son. I'll be married within the year, and then my life will be devoted to being a proper wife and mother." "At least you'll have books," Silas said, trying to offer some comfort. Eleanor laughed bitterly. "Will I?" "Senator Morrison's son has already expressed his opinion that too much reading makes women difficult to manage. He suggested that my library should be limited to household management guides and religious texts." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of voices in the hallway, Governor Whitmore returning from his offices, accompanied by several other men. Eleanor quickly moved away from the window, and Silas grabbed his cleaning supplies, trying to look busy. "You should go," Eleanor whispered urgently, "if Father finds you here." But it was too late. The parlor door opened, and Governor Whitmore entered with 3 other gentlemen, all prominent figures in Charleston society. Silas immediately dropped his gaze to the floor, hoping to become invisible. "Ah, Eleanor, my dear," the governor said warmly, "I hope we're not disturbing your studies." "Not at all, Father," Eleanor replied, her voice taking on the sweet, submissive tone that Silas had never heard her use before. "I was just reviewing my French lessons." Governor Whitmore was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that came from a lifetime of wielding power. His eyes swept the room and settled on Silas with the casual indifference one might show a piece of furniture. "Boy," he said sharply, "have you finished your work here?" "Nearly, sir," Silas replied, keeping his eyes downcast. "Well, hurry it along. We have important matters to discuss." As Silas gathered his supplies, he caught fragments of the men's conversation. They were discussing the growing tensions over slavery, the increasing pressure from northern abolitionists, and the need to maintain order in the face of what they saw as outside interference. "The problem," one of the men was saying, "is that these ideas about equality are spreading. We must be more vigilant about preventing our property from being exposed to such dangerous notions." "Quite right," Governor Whitmore agreed. "Education is a privilege that must be carefully controlled. Give them too much knowledge and they start getting ideas above their station." Silas felt his face burning with shame and anger, but he forced himself to remain impassive. As he moved toward the door, he risked a glance at Miss Eleanor. She was staring at her hands, her face pale, with what looked like disgust at her father's words. Just as he reached the doorway, one of the guests, a thin man with cold eyes, spoke up. "Whitmore, you might want to keep a closer eye on your house servants. I've heard rumors that some plantation owners have had trouble with slaves who've learned to read. Dangerous business, that." Governor Whitmore's expression darkened. "Any slave caught reading on my property would be dealt with severely. I assure you, gentlemen, I maintain strict discipline here." Silas escaped into the hallway, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. The conversation continued behind him, but he forced himself to walk calmly toward the servants' quarters, even as every instinct screamed at him to run. That night, as he lay on his straw mattress in the cramped quarters he shared with 3 other enslaved men, Silas stared at the ceiling and thought about his conversation with Miss Eleanor. Her words about different kinds of cages echoed in his mind, along with her father's casual dismissal of his humanity. For the first time in his life, Silas began to truly understand the power of the written word, not just as a source of knowledge or escape, but as a weapon that could challenge the very foundations of the world that held him captive. And for the first time, he began to believe that perhaps those foundations were not as solid as they appeared. A week passed before Silas saw Miss Eleanor again. During that time, he found himself replaying their conversation over and over, analyzing every word, every gesture, every emotion that had flickered across her face. The revelation that someone of her station could feel trapped had shaken his understanding of the world, but it had also awakened something dangerous within him, a sense of kinship with someone he should have seen as his natural superior. The opportunity for another encounter came when Mrs. Hartwell assigned him to deliver fresh linens to the guest rooms on the 2nd floor. As he climbed the servants' staircase, his arms full of crisp white sheets, Silas heard the sound of piano music drifting from the music room. The melody was melancholy and beautiful, filled with a longing that seemed to echo his own restless spirit. Curiosity overcame caution, and he found himself drawn toward the sound. Through the partially open door, he could see Miss Eleanor at the piano, her fingers dancing across the keys with practiced grace. But there was something different about her playing. It wasn't the rigid, formal style he had heard during her lessons with the music master. This was raw, emotional, filled with a passion that seemed to pour directly from her soul. As the last notes faded away, Eleanor remained seated at the piano, her head bowed as if the music had drained something vital from her. When she finally looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "That was beautiful, miss," Silas said softly from the doorway. Eleanor startled, then smiled when she saw who had spoken. "Silas, I didn't hear you come up. I'm sorry to disturb you. I was just delivering linens and I heard the music." "It's all right," she said, gesturing for him to enter. "I was just expressing some feelings that I'm not supposed to have." Silas set down his bundle of linens and moved closer to the piano. The instrument was a magnificent piece, polished mahogany, with ivory keys that gleamed in the afternoon light. He had never been this close to such a beautiful object, and he found himself wondering what it would feel like to create music with his own hands. "Do you play?" Eleanor asked, noticing his fascination. "No, miss. I've never had the opportunity to learn." "Would you like to try?" The question caught him completely off guard. "Miss, I couldn't. It wouldn't be proper." "There's no one here but us," Eleanor said, sliding over on the piano bench to make room. "And I think propriety is overrated, don't you?" Against his better judgment, Silas found himself sitting beside her on the bench. The proximity was shocking. He had never been this close to a white woman, let alone one of Miss Eleanor's status. He could smell the lavender water she wore, could see the delicate blue veins beneath her pale skin. "Here," she said, taking his right hand and placing it on the keys. "Try pressing this one." The note that emerged was clear and pure, hanging in the air between them like a bridge across the vast social chasm that separated their worlds. Eleanor guided his fingers to other keys, showing him how to create simple melodies. "You have good hands for this," she observed. "Long fingers, gentle touch. With practice, you could be quite accomplished." "Practice is a luxury I'll never have," Silas replied, but there was no bitterness in his voice, only acceptance of a reality he had never questioned until recently. "Perhaps not formal practice," Eleanor said thoughtfully, "but there are other ways to learn. Books about music theory, for instance. Ways to understand the structure behind the beauty." She was doing it again, speaking in that coded way that seemed to offer possibilities while acknowledging the impossibility of their situation. Silas found himself studying her profile as she played a simple melody, wondering what thoughts moved behind those blue eyes. "Miss Eleanor," he said suddenly, surprising himself with his boldness, "may I ask you something?" "Of course." "What do you see when you look out your window?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. She stopped playing and turned to face him fully. "What do you mean? The other day, in the parlor, you were looking out the window with such longing. I wondered what you saw there that made you look so sad." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently picking out a soft melody on the keys. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I see the road that leads away from here," she said. "I see the world beyond these walls, a world I'll never be allowed to explore. I see freedom, Silas, real freedom, not the gilded cage I live in." "But you could leave," Silas said, confused. "You're not. You're not bound here like I am." Eleanor laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Aren't I? Where would I go? I have no money of my own. Everything I have belongs to my father, and when I marry, it will belong to my husband. I have no skills that would allow me to support myself. I've been educated to be ornamental, not useful. And even if I could somehow escape, where would I go? What woman travels alone without being considered fallen?" She turned back to the piano, her fingers finding a more complex melody, something that spoke of yearning and frustration. "At least you have hope," she continued. "Terrible as your situation is, there are people working to change it. There are those who believe that slavery is wrong, who fight for abolition. But who fights for women like me? Who questions whether it's right to trade us like property in marriage contracts?" Silas felt a chill run down his spine. The parallel she was drawing was dangerous. Comparing her situation to his own bondage was the kind of thinking that could get them both in serious trouble. Yet he couldn't deny the truth in her words. "I never thought of it that way," he admitted. "Most people don't," Eleanor replied. "We're taught to be grateful for our comfortable prisons, to see our limitations as protection rather than oppression." She stopped playing abruptly and turned to face him again. "But you understand, don't you? You understand what it means to have a mind that yearns for more than your circumstances allow?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications that neither of them dared voice directly. Silas felt as though he stood at the edge of a precipice. One step forward would change everything, but it might also destroy them both. "Yes," he said simply, "I understand." Eleanor smiled then, and for a moment the social barriers between them seemed to dissolve entirely. They were just two young people, trapped by circumstances beyond their control, finding solace in their shared understanding. "What would you do," Eleanor asked suddenly, "if you could go anywhere, be anything? If there were no barriers, no limitations, what would your life look like?" The question was so far outside the realm of possibility that Silas had never allowed himself to truly consider it. But sitting there beside her, surrounded by music and possibility, he found himself speaking dreams he had never dared voice. "I would learn," he said, "everything I could. I would read every book ever written, study science and philosophy and literature. I would travel to see the places I've only read about in stolen moments. I would. He paused, then continued with growing conviction. I would teach others. I would help other people like me learn to read and write, because knowledge is the only thing they can't take away from you once you have it. Eleanor's eyes shone with something that might have been admiration. That's beautiful, Silas. That's a worthy dream. What about you? He asked. What would you do if you were truly free? I would study at a university, she said without hesitation. I would debate philosophy with the greatest minds of our time. I would write essays, perhaps, or poetry. I would travel to Europe and see the great libraries and museums, and I would. She hesitated, then continued with a rush of passion. I would fight for other women to have the same opportunities. I would speak out against the injustices that we're taught to accept as natural law. They sat in silence for a moment, both lost in visions of impossible futures. Then Eleanor spoke again, her voice soft but determined. Silas, I want to show you something, but you must promise me that you'll never tell anyone about it. I promise, miss. Eleanor rose from the piano bench and moved to a bookshelf in the corner of the room. She pressed against one of the volumes, and to Silas's amazement, a section of the shelf swung inward, revealing a hidden compartment. My secret library, she said with a conspiratorial smile. Books that father would never approve of, ideas that are considered too dangerous for a young lady's mind. She pulled out several volumes, and Silas's eyes widened as he read the titles. Uncle Tom's Cabin, by Harriet Beecher Stowe. A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, by Mary Wollstonecraft. Essays by Frederick Douglass. These were books that could get them both in serious trouble. Works that challenged the very foundations of Southern society. How did you get these? He whispered. I have my ways, Eleanor said with a mysterious smile. There are people in Charleston, quiet people, careful people, who believe that knowledge should not be restricted by race or gender. They help me acquire books that expand my understanding of the world. She handed him the Frederick Douglass volume. Have you read any of his work? Silas shook his head, though his hands trembled as he held the book. Frederick Douglass was a name whispered in the slave quarters, a man who had escaped bondage and become a powerful voice for abolition. To hold his actual words was both thrilling and terrifying. He writes about the power of literacy, Eleanor said, about how learning to read opened his eyes to the injustice of his situation and gave him the tools to fight against it. She opened the book to a marked passage and read aloud, "Once you learn to read, you will be forever free." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. Here was a man who had lived his reality, who had found a way to transform knowledge into liberation. The possibility seemed both impossible and inevitable. "Why are you showing me this?" Silas asked, his voice barely audible. Eleanor closed the book and looked directly into his eyes. "Because I think you're ready to hear it. Because I think you understand that knowledge is not just about personal enrichment, it's about changing the world." Before Silas could respond, the sound of footsteps in the hallway sent them both into a panic. Eleanor quickly returned the books to their hiding place and closed the secret compartment, while Silas grabbed his bundle of linens and tried to look as though he had been working. The door opened and Mrs. Hartwell appeared, her sharp eyes taking in the scene with suspicion. "Silas, what are you doing in here? You were supposed to be delivering linens, not bothering Miss Eleanor." "It's quite all right, Mrs. Hartwell," Eleanor said smoothly. "I asked Silas to help me move the piano bench. He was just being helpful." The housekeeper's expression softened slightly at Eleanor's explanation, but her eyes remained wary. "Well, see that you finish your duties promptly, boy. There's work to be done." "Yes, ma'am," Silas replied, gathering his things and heading for the door. As he left the music room, he heard Eleanor begin to play again, but this time it was a proper, formal piece, the kind of music expected from a well-bred young lady. The passionate, emotional playing he had witnessed earlier was hidden away, just like her secret books and her dangerous ideas. That night, as Silas lay in his quarters, he couldn't stop thinking about Frederick Douglass's words, "Once you learn to read, you will be forever free." He thought about Eleanor's hidden library, about her dreams of university and travel, about the way her eyes had shone when she spoke of fighting for justice. For the first time in his life, Silas began to believe that perhaps the walls that confined him were not as permanent as they seemed. Perhaps knowledge really could be a key to freedom, not just for him, but for others like him. And perhaps, in the most unlikely of places, he had found an ally in his quest for that freedom. The weeks that followed were a delicate dance of stolen moments and whispered conversations. Eleanor and Silas found ways to meet in secret, brief encounters in empty hallways, coded exchanges during his cleaning duties, and precious minutes in the music room when the rest of the household was occupied elsewhere. Each meeting brought new revelations. Eleanor shared more books from her hidden library, while Silas offered insights from his own experiences and the stories passed down through generations of enslaved people. They discussed philosophy and literature, but also the harsh realities of their respective situations. Through these conversations, both began to see their world with new eyes. It was during one of these clandestine meetings that everything changed. Silas was in the parlor, ostensibly dusting the furniture, while Eleanor read nearby. They had developed a system of communication that allowed them to share ideas even when others were present. Subtle gestures, meaningful glances, and carefully chosen words that carried double meanings. On this particular afternoon, Eleanor was reading aloud from a book of poetry, her voice carrying across the room as Silas worked. To any observer, it would appear to be nothing more than a young lady practicing her elocution while a servant went about his duties. But the poem she had chosen was The Slave's Dream by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and every word carried weight. Beside the ungathered rice he lay, his sickle in his hand. His breast was bare. His matted hair was buried in the sand. As Eleanor's voice wove the tale of an enslaved man dreaming of freedom, Silas felt something stirring within him, a recognition of his own yearning for liberation, but also something more. The poem spoke not just of individual dreams, but of a collective longing for justice that transcended personal circumstances. When Eleanor finished reading, she closed the book and looked directly at him. "What do you think, Silas? What does freedom mean to you?" The question was dangerous, too direct, too loaded with implications, but something in her eyes told him that this was more than idle curiosity. This was a test, a moment that would define the nature of their relationship going forward. "I think," Silas said carefully, continuing to dust while he spoke, "that freedom means different things to different people. For some, it might mean the ability to come and go as they please. For others, it might mean the right to learn and grow and become everything they're capable of being." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "And what about the responsibility that comes with freedom? If one were to gain it, what would one owe to those still trapped?" The question hit Silas like a revelation. She wasn't just asking about personal liberation. She was asking about obligation, about the duty that came with privilege and opportunity. "I think," he said slowly, "that anyone who gains freedom has a responsibility to help others find theirs. Knowledge shared is knowledge multiplied." Eleanor smiled, and in that smile, Silas saw something that took his breath away. Respect. Not the condescending approval of a mistress pleased with a servant's clever response, but the genuine respect of one equal mind recognizing another. "I've been thinking about that a great deal lately," Eleanor said. "About responsibility and obligation, about what it means to have advantages that others don't, and how one might use those advantages for good." She rose from her chair and moved to the window, gazing out at the grounds where other enslaved people worked under the watchful eyes of overseers. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "There are people in Charleston, Silas, people who believe that change is not only possible but inevitable, people who are working to make that change happen." Silas felt his heart begin to race. Was she saying what he thought she was saying? "What kind of people, miss?" Eleanor turned back to him, and her expression was more serious than he had ever seen it. "People who believe that all human beings deserve freedom and dignity, regardless of the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth. People who are willing to take risks to help others." The implications of her words hung in the air between them, like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Silas knew that once he stepped onto that bridge, there would be no going back. But he also knew that he had been moving toward this moment since the first day he had dared to pick up a book and read. "That sounds dangerous," he said. "It is," Eleanor agreed, "but so is accepting injustice, so is living a lie, so is pretending that the world as it exists is the world as it should be." She moved closer to him, her voice dropping to barely audible levels. "There's a network. Silas, people who help enslaved individuals escape to freedom. They call it the Underground Railroad, though it's neither underground nor a railroad. It's a system of safe houses and secret routes that lead north to states where slavery is illegal." Silas felt the world tilt beneath his feet. The Underground Railroad was whispered about in the slave quarters, spoken of in hushed tones as something between legend and hope. To hear it discussed so matter-of-factly by the governor's daughter was almost beyond comprehension. "Why are you telling me this?" he whispered. "Because I think you're ready to hear it," Eleanor replied, "and because I think you might be willing to help." "Help how?" Eleanor glanced toward the door, ensuring they were still alone, then continued. "The network needs people on the inside, people who can identify those ready to make the journey, people who can pass along information, people who can help prepare others for what lies ahead." "You're asking me to become part of the Underground Railroad?" "I'm asking you to consider it. I'm asking you to think about what Frederick Douglass wrote. That knowledge is the pathway to freedom, not just for yourself, but for others." Silas felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was suggesting. To join the Underground Railroad would mean risking everything: his life, the lives of others, the safety of anyone who helped him. But it would also mean the possibility of real change, real freedom, not just for himself, but for countless others. "What would I have to do?" he asked. "For now, just listen and learn. There are others here, people you wouldn't suspect, who are part of the network. They'll teach you what you need to know, help you understand how the system works." She paused, then added, "But Silas, you need to understand that once you're in, there's no going back. This isn't a game or an adventure. People's lives depend on absolute secrecy and complete commitment." Silas thought about Mama Ruth, who had risked everything to teach him to read. He thought about the countless others who lived in bondage, who had never had the opportunities he had been given. He thought about the books in Eleanor's secret library, about Frederick Douglass's words, about the power of knowledge to transform lives. "I want to help," he said finally. "I want to be part of it." Eleanor's face lit up with a mixture of relief and admiration. "I hoped you would say that. But I need you to be absolutely certain. Take some time to think about it. Consider what you're risking, what you're gaining, what it means for your future." "I don't need time," Silas said with growing conviction. "I've been thinking about this my whole life, even when I didn't know what I was thinking about. I've been preparing for this moment since the first time I learned to read, since the first time I realized that the world could be different than it is." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Then we begin tonight. After the household is asleep, meet me in the music room. There's someone I want you to meet." The rest of the day passed in a blur of nervous anticipation. Silas went about his duties mechanically, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. He was about to cross a line that would change everything, not just for himself, but potentially for many others. That night, as the Whitmore estate settled into sleep, Silas made his way quietly through the darkened hallways to the music room. Eleanor was already there, but she was not alone. Sitting in the shadows was a figure he recognized, but had never really noticed. Thomas, the estate's head gardener, a free black man who had worked for the Whitmores for over a decade. "Silas," Thomas said quietly, rising from his chair. "Miss Eleanor tells me you're interested in joining our cause." "Yes, sir," Silas replied, still struggling to process the revelation that Thomas was part of the Underground Railroad. "This is not a decision to be made lightly," Thomas continued. "What we do requires absolute discretion, complete loyalty, and unwavering courage. Are you prepared for that?" "I am." Thomas studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Miss Eleanor speaks highly of your intelligence and your character. Those are essential qualities for what we do. But intelligence and character alone are not enough. You must also be willing to put the welfare of others before your own safety." "I understand." "Do you?" Thomas challenged. "Do you understand that you might be called upon to help others escape while remaining behind yourself? Do you understand that you might have to watch others gain their freedom while you continue to live in bondage? Do you understand that the work we do might never directly benefit you, but that you must do it anyway because it's right? The questions hit Silas like physical blows. He had been thinking primarily of his own potential escape, his own journey to freedom. The idea that he might spend years helping others while remaining enslaved himself was something he hadn't fully considered. But as he thought about it, he realized that Thomas was right. This wasn't about personal gain, it was about justice, about using whatever advantages he had to help others. And he did have advantages: his literacy, his position in the house, his relationship with Eleanor. "Yes," he said finally. "I understand, and I'm still willing." Thomas smiled for the first time since the conversation began. "Good. Then let me tell you how this works." For the next hour, Thomas and Eleanor explained the intricate network that had been operating under the very noses of Charleston's elite. There were safe houses throughout the city, operated by both free blacks and sympathetic whites. There were coded messages passed through seemingly innocent conversations. There were routes mapped out through swamps and forests, leading north to freedom. "Your role," Thomas explained, "will be to identify potential candidates, people who are ready to make the journey, who have the strength and determination to see it through. You'll also help prepare them, teaching them what they need to know about the route, about how to avoid capture, about what to expect when they reach the north. And you'll continue to learn," Eleanor added. "The more you know, the more valuable you become to the cause. Knowledge is our most powerful weapon." As the meeting concluded, Silas felt a sense of purpose unlike anything he had ever experienced. For the first time in his life, he was not just surviving, he was fighting back. He was part of something larger than himself, something that could change the world. "There's one more thing," Eleanor said as they prepared to leave. "My engagement to Senator Morrison's son has been finalized. The wedding is set for next spring." The news hit Silas like a physical blow. In all their conversations about freedom and justice, he had somehow managed to forget that Eleanor's own cage was closing around her. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "Don't be," Eleanor replied, though he could see the pain in her eyes. "It just means that our work becomes more urgent. I have perhaps 6 months before my ability to help will be severely limited. We need to make the most of that time." As Silas made his way back to his quarters that night, his mind was spinning with everything he had learned. He was now part of the Underground Railroad, committed to helping others find freedom, even as his own remained uncertain. Eleanor would soon be married, trapped in a different kind of bondage, and somewhere out there, in the darkness beyond the estate's walls, people were moving along secret routes toward liberty. The question he had asked Eleanor weeks ago, "What lies beyond that window?" had been answered in ways he never could have imagined. Beyond that window lay not just the physical world, but a network of hope and resistance that stretched across the continent. Beyond that window lay the possibility of change, of justice, of a future where the color of one's skin or the circumstances of one's birth would not determine the limits of one's life. And now, for the first time, Silas was not just dreaming of that future, he was helping to create it. 6 months later. The morning of Eleanor's wedding dawned grey and cold, matching the somber mood that had settled over the Whitmore estate. Silas watched from the servants' quarters as carriages arrived bearing Charleston's elite, all come to witness the union that would secure Governor Whitmore's political future and seal Eleanor's fate. In the months since that fateful night in the music room, Silas had become an integral part of the Underground Railroad network. He had helped 17 people escape to freedom, using his position in the house to gather intelligence and his growing network of contacts to coordinate safe passage. Each successful escape had strengthened his resolve and deepened his understanding of the power that came with knowledge and courage. Eleanor had been true to her word, using her remaining months of relative freedom to expand the network's reach. She had recruited 3 more sympathizers among Charleston's elite, established 2 new safe houses, and helped secure funding for the dangerous work they were doing. But now, as she prepared to marry a man who viewed her as little more than an ornamental possession, her active role in the resistance would necessarily come to an end. As the wedding ceremony began in the estate's grand ballroom, Silas found himself in the unusual position of serving the guests, a role that allowed him to move freely through the crowd, while remaining essentially invisible. He listened to conversations about politics and business, gathering information that might prove useful to the network. It was during one of these eavesdropping sessions that he overheard something that made his blood run cold. "I tell you, Whitmore," Senator Morrison was saying to the governor, "there's definitely Underground Railroad activity in Charleston. My sources tell me they've helped dozens of slaves escape in recent months." "Impossible," Governor Whitmore replied. "I maintain strict security on my property, and I know the other plantation owners do the same. Nevertheless, it's happening. And I suspect there are sympathizers among the white population, people who should know better, helping these fugitives." Silas felt his heart racing as he continued to listen. "What do you propose we do about it?" Governor Whitmore asked. "Increase patrols for one thing, rewards for information leading to arrests, and perhaps most importantly, we need to identify and eliminate the leaders of this network." As the conversation continued, Silas realized that the net was closing around them. The success of their operations had attracted attention, and it was only a matter of time before someone was caught. He needed to warn Thomas and the others, but first he had to get through the wedding without arousing suspicion. The ceremony itself was a study in contrasts. Eleanor looked beautiful in her white silk gown, but Silas could see the sadness in her eyes as she spoke her vows. Her new husband, Charles Morrison, Jr., was a handsome man in his 30s, but his cold demeanor and the possessive way he looked at Eleanor made Silas's skin crawl. As the reception began, Silas found a moment to approach Eleanor during the dancing. Under the pretense of refilling her champagne glass, he was able to whisper a warning about what he had overheard. Eleanor's face went pale, but she maintained her composure. "Thank you," she whispered back. "Be careful, Silas. Be very careful." Those were the last words they would ever exchange. 3 days later, the raids began. Silas was awakened before dawn by the sound of horses and shouting voices. Through the small window of his quarters, he could see torches moving across the estate grounds. His first thought was that they had been discovered, but as the commotion continued, he realized that the raid was not focused on the Whitmore property. It was happening throughout Charleston. Over the next several hours, as news filtered through the servant network, the scope of the crackdown became clear. Dozens of people had been arrested, including several prominent white citizens suspected of Underground Railroad involvement. Safe houses had been raided, documents seized, and the entire network that had taken years to build was in shambles. Thomas was among those arrested. So were 2 of the other key organizers Silas had come to know and respect. By some miracle, or perhaps because his role had been more carefully concealed, Silas himself was not taken. But he knew it was only a matter of time. That evening, as he went about his duties with forced normalcy, Silas received an unexpected visitor. Eleanor's personal maid, Sarah, approached him in the kitchen with a message. Mrs. Morrison, asked me to give you this," Sarah said, pressing a small folded paper into his hand. Silas waited until he was alone to read the note. Eleanor's elegant handwriting conveyed a message that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. "My dear friend, by the time you read this, I will be gone from Charleston, beginning my new life as Mrs. Morrison. I want you to know that our conversations and our work together have been the most meaningful part of my life. You opened my eyes to possibilities I never imagined and showed me what true courage looks like. The network may be broken, but the idea behind it cannot be destroyed. Knowledge, once shared, cannot be taken back. The seeds we planted will grow in ways we cannot foresee. I have arranged for certain resources to be available to you, should you choose to continue the work. Thomas's cousin in Philadelphia has been contacted and is expecting communication from you. The choice, as always, is yours. Remember what Frederick Douglass wrote, once you learn to read, you will be forever free. You are free, Silas, in the ways that matter most. Use that freedom wisely. Your friend always, E. Attached to the note was a small key and an address, the location of a safe deposit box that Eleanor had arranged through her network of sympathizers. Inside, Silas would later discover, were enough funds to support Underground Railroad activities for months. along with detailed maps of northern routes and a list of contacts who could be trusted. But that discovery would come later. For now, Silas sat in his cramped quarters, holding Eleanor's letter and contemplating the choice before him. The smart thing would be to keep his head down, avoid suspicion, and wait for the current crisis to pass. The safe thing would be to abandon the dangerous work that had already cost so many their freedom or their lives. But as he thought about the 17 people who had found freedom because of their network, as he remembered the hope in their eyes as they began their journeys north, Silas knew there was really no choice at all. 3 weeks later, on a moonless night, Silas Washington disappeared from the Whitmore estate. Governor Whitmore assumed he had simply run away, another piece of property lost to the growing chaos of the times. A reward was posted, but no trace of the missing slave was ever found. What Governor Whitmore didn't know was that Silas had not run away. He had been transformed. Using Eleanor's resources and contacts, he had established himself in Philadelphia as a free man named Samuel Freeman. There, working with Thomas's cousin and other abolitionists, he helped rebuild the Underground Railroad network that had been shattered in Charleston. Over the next 15 years, Samuel Freeman became one of the most effective conductors on the Underground Railroad. He personally guided over 300 enslaved people to freedom, established a school for freed slaves, and wrote powerful essays about the importance of education in the fight against oppression. His work caught the attention of Frederick Douglass himself, who became both a mentor and a close friend. Eleanor Morrison, meanwhile, lived the constrained life of a wealthy Southern wife. She bore 3 children and maintained the social facade expected of her station. But she never forgot the lessons learned in those secret conversations with Silas. In small ways, through charitable work, through quiet conversations with other women, through the education she provided her own children, she continued to plant seeds of change. When the Civil War finally came, Samuel Freeman served as a scout and intelligence gatherer for the Union Army, using his knowledge of Southern geography and society to help bring about the end of slavery. Eleanor, trapped in a confederacy she had never believed in, secretly provided information to Union sympathizers and helped coordinate aid for escaped slaves. They never saw each other again after that wedding day in 1848, but their influence on each other's lives continued to ripple outward in ways neither could have imagined. After the war, Samuel Freeman established the Freeman Institute, a school dedicated to educating formerly enslaved people and their children. Above the entrance to the main building, he had carved a simple inscription: "Knowledge is the pathway to freedom." Students who passed through those doors would go on to become teachers, doctors, lawyers, and leaders in their communities, carrying forward the belief that education could transform not just individual lives, but society itself. Eleanor Morrison lived to see the end of slavery, though she did not live to see women gain the right to vote. But her daughter, educated with the same passion for justice that Eleanor had discovered in her conversations with Silas, became a prominent suffragette and civil rights activist. The ideas that had been planted in secret conversations in a Charleston parlor bloomed into a legacy of activism that would span generations. In 1895, nearly 50 years after their first meeting, Samuel Freeman received an unexpected package. Inside was a worn copy of Frederick Douglass's autobiography, the same book Eleanor had shown him from her secret library, along with a brief note. "For Samuel Freeman, with gratitude for showing me that courage comes in many forms. The question you asked about what lay beyond the window has been answered in ways neither of us could have imagined. The world is larger and more beautiful than we dared to dream. A friend." Samuel smiled as he read the note, recognizing Eleanor's handwriting despite the passage of years. He placed the book in his personal library next to the hundreds of other volumes that had shaped his understanding of the world. That evening, he shared the story with his students, not the specific details that might compromise anyone's safety, but the essential truth that knowledge shared between unlikely allies could change the course of history. The question that had started it all, what lies beyond that window, had been answered in the most profound way possible. Beyond that window lay not just the physical world, but the infinite possibility of human connection, understanding, and transformation. Beyond that window lay the future they had helped to create. One conversation, one book, one act of courage at a time. The story of Silas and Eleanor reminds us that revolution often begins not with grand gestures or dramatic proclamations, but with quiet conversations between people who dare to see each other as human beings, rather than representatives of their respective stations. In a world designed to keep them apart, they found common ground in their shared hunger for knowledge and their mutual recognition that the existing order was neither natural nor permanent. Their brief friendship, conducted in stolen moments and whispered conversations, planted seeds that would grow into movements that transformed a nation. The Underground Railroad, the abolition movement, the fight for women's rights, all were built on the foundation of individuals who refused to accept that the world as it was represented the world as it should be. The question Silas asked, "What lies beyond that window?" continues to resonate today. In every generation, there are those who look beyond the limitations imposed by society and dare to imagine something better. In every generation, there are unlikely alliances formed between people who should be enemies, but choose instead to be friends. In every generation, there are quiet acts of courage that ripple outward to change the world. The window that Silas and Eleanor looked through together revealed not just the landscape beyond the Whitmore estate, but the vast horizon of human possibility. Their story reminds us that no barrier is permanent, no injustice is inevitable, and no dream of freedom is too bold to pursue. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and share it with others. History is full of untold stories of courage and hope, stories that remind us of our shared humanity and our collective power to create change. What window will you look through today? What question will you dare to ask? Remember, knowledge shared is knowledge multiplied, and every conversation has the power to change the world.